What's the matter with
talking about
libertarianism?
Yeah, we're talking about this article from Psychology Today by Peter Corning, Ph.D. So
Yep.
obviously he's a doctor of philosophy, which means that if you disagree with this, you're going to be against science. But we'll just take it for granted that you're against science. I'm going to read through it real quick. And his contention here is that libertarianism is a form of psychological deviancy, as far as I can tell. So what's the matter with libertarianism? I've highlighted. Of course, any watchers here should go ahead and read through it. It's in Psychology Today. What's the matter with libertarianism?
His main point is that human nature belies everything libertarians believe.
So he's more or less demolished your arguments for libertarianism and shown that you're sort of pathologically deficient. How do you respond?
Well, it's the most unlearned account of libertarianism I've come across in a long time. Nearly every of his major points is integral to libertarian thought, has been from the start with Adam Smith and especially Herbert Spencer. His response, the last two paragraphs about basically the social survivability and all that kind of stuff, is when Herbert Spencer said that, he's called a social Darwinist and castigated as cruel. When he says that he's supposed to be somehow great, there is so much nonsense here. It would be idiotic to. Well, for one thing, let's not talk about the last paragraph, because Gerson is talking about conservatism, and it's just an assertion, and it's kind of a witless ending. I mean, let's give him his due and go for the real meat of the piece. Really, which I think is his main point, which is about human nature, which is earlier on when he says we evolved as intensely interdependent social animals, and our sense of empathy toward others, our sensitivity to reciprocity, our desire for inclusion, and our loyalty to the groups we bond with. And he goes on. It's a lot of stuff in one paragraph. And it's an interesting charge. Okay, that's an interesting charge. Because it's all true. We did evolve to intensely interdependent social animals. We do have a sense of empathy towards others. It is the groundwork of morality. And all this stuff, I mean, that's all true. So libertarians must be wrong. Okay, so let's go back. Take my two big heroes, Adam Smith and Herbert Spencer. Adam Smith was the founder of a British political economy, and was well known as an advocate of laissez faire, or something very close to it. He referred to the laissez faire as the simple system of natural liberty. His earlier book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, is one of the most sophisticated books on ethics written at that time. And then Herbert Spencer, who tried to show the evolutionary origins of everything and plot where things might go, and came up with some fascinating theories of all this. And both these guys were theorists of sympathy. Both of them are basically libertarians, and both of them interdependence. This is what economics is all about. This idea that interdependence is something libertarians have no clue about is so stupid that you have to wonder if this man ever talked to a libertarian in his life. Because what do libertarians talk about in economics? The interdependence, all this talk about invisible hand, which he pillories as, greatest good for the greatest number, and leading to that. It's all about evolved emergent orders. This is what economics from libertarian standpoint is all about. It's economic harmonies, according to Bastiat, the most popular proselytizer for libertarian ideas in France in the 19th century. So what is it that he believes that we don't believe? Okay, here's the thing, inclusion. We do have a desire for inclusion. Now remember, inclusion is the buzzword and the obsession of the left these days. This is the idea that they are absolutely committed to in a way that makes them seem monomaniacal. Listen to a social justice warrior, and inclusion is behind everything. However, these are the most exclusionary bunch of people I've ever come across. They are constantly outing other people as evil, and it's an amazing group of weirdness that we see. And here we get to the point: inclusion. I'm going to read. I wrote a critique of this whole piece, and I think I better read from that critique. If I can find the okay. Spencer called the inclusionary and loyalty aspects of human cooperation the ethics of amity in the first chapters of the Inductions of Ethics. What our critic misses is what all modern progressives shield from their eyes. In parallel to this in-group allegiance exists a Chthonian but out-group antagonism, which is just as much a part of our evolutionary heritage as empathy and the general sense of cooperativeness. And this is what we must contend with. Human beings form in-groups and out-groups, and then they go to war. And the in-groups are not always lovey-dovey affairs where it's all about inclusion and equality. These are things that people talk about, but that's not how actual in-groups work. They're almost always hierarchical, and often a lot of coercion goes on, and individuals get trampled down. This is what states generally were in the old days, and this is what all socialisms devolved to. They become crushing. Anyway, so and this other aspect of inclusion, exclusion, the exclusion part is the ethics of enmity. And this has also been throughout the history of human civilization. The ethics of enmity has had a huge part in the foundation and structure of social systems. It is inevitable in eras of vast social conflict. It has always uneasily existed in parallel to loftier or more charitable sounding pronouncements of amity. And with the liberal tradition, modern libertarianism especially, which in a sense grew out of Spencer's work, though most libertarians don't realize it, and this guy has no cluck and foo, always tried to solve the problems of human discord by rationalizing the terms of peace. What libertarianism is a regulation of the mechanisms of in-group, out-group antagonisms. And the idea is that there should be one principle of justice. It applies up and down all over the place. Every individual and every group that they form has to abide by the same rules. This is what liberalism brought to the modern world. This is individualism, wherein we control the abuses of hierarchy, where we control exploitation and pretty much try to make it not happen through the rule of law and liberty. That's what it's all about. And all this stuff about inclusion, and this is covered in the basic ideas that liberalism advanced. Pretending that libertarians have a Homo economicus view of human nature is stupid. I don't know of anyone who does. The anarcho-capitalists, who are the most radical libertarians around, are generally Austrians, and they have a very complex view of human nature, and they do not rely on Homo economicus. Anyone who charges libertarianism with Homo economicus has not read the literature. You just don't get to say it. This is stupid. And you can say that they still, you can make your charges, but you at least have to admit that libertarians have not supported Homo economicus. In fact, the only advocates of Homo economicus that I know of are pretty much big government progressives and big government centrists. They look at Homo economicus because that's their modus operandi in social science, but it's not what they think human nature is, really. He confuses all sorts of stuff here, and pretending that libertarianism is just atomism, that there's no community sense of libertarians. Well, that's because we have a standard. We want voluntary communities, and we want to have the state conform to the actual rights of individuals rather than just run rampant, as it always has throughout human history, as a vast exploiter and killer of men. This idea, there's almost nothing in this piece that doesn't annoy me to the extreme. He doesn't mention the basic libertarian idea. Aside from not talking really much about freedom, the same standards that apply to individuals must apply to groups of individuals, including the people working in the state. That's what libertarians say. You don't have a right to initiate force. That goes for you and me and this weird person who wrote this awful article, and it also goes for members of the Rotary, and it goes for members of the state. That's why we have limited government, because the state doesn't get to do those things. And he does not confront the coercive nature and the initiatory force nature of the state. He buries it once again in all his fancy highfalutin lies, and they have to be considered lies because they're so far from the truth. So he buries the aspect of coercion in a lot of fluff. This man, I guess he's probably earnest. I presume he's earnest, but he's supposed to be a theorist of complexity. That's the other thing he says about him. He is studying complexity. And the complexity theorist of the 19th century was Herbert Spencer. F.I. Hayek, who he mentions once only to misinterpret, and I mean radically misinterpret. That is not what Hayek said. What he's quoting him as saying, that it's stupid what he says about Hayek says.
Hayek said?
Well, you have it in front of you. I don't have it in front of me.
Criticized posited a stark choice between two alternative models, either free market of atomized individuals rationally pursuing their self-interest, or a coercive authoritarian state.
Well, that's his interpretation of what Hayek did. It has nothing to do with Hayek's basic points. Hayek and the Road to Serfdom wasn't even for free markets. I mean, he was for regulated markets in the mainstream fashion. He was defending a modern state against the idea of controlling industry by government. That's what he was doing in the Road to Serfdom. He was saying that once the state starts regulating every aspect of production and exchange, it becomes totalitarian just as such. And it's worth noting that we don't do all that much of it even in America, and there's less of it in places like Sweden and Denmark, which have freer markets than we do and don't control their corporations quite as much. So there's just so much weirdness involved in his piece.
Well, what about the United States? I mean, the United States has plenty of market manipulation.
There's plenty of market.
It hasn't evolved into totalitarianism.
Well, it has evolved into totalitarianism to some people. I mean, the U.S. government rests a heavy hand on some people. I wouldn't really want. I mean. Do you think the inner city blacks are really being treated nicely in America? Do you think people who use a bulldozer to change the water course on their land is being treated nicely? People have been just deprived of their property and charged with criminal offenses under the EPA in a frankly a totalitarian way. And Americans just don't bat an eye. There are rights violations everywhere in America, and we blithely go on because they're not happening to us or because we don't care about what those people have. I don't own a farm, therefore I don't care what regulations are placed upon farmers about water. Okay, or I don't take drugs, so I don't care if we're treating a quarter of the population like miserable outcasts. I mean, it's embarrassing. There are totalitarian aspects of America, tyrannical certainly, but we also should note we do not live in a completely dirigistic economy. We have a lot of contradictory and weird regulations, and the best thing about America is half the time people don't know that they're being regulated, so they go about doing their business as if they weren't being regulated. But what it means is that it allows government to nab almost anyone in the country at almost any time for some stupid regulation that no one even knew about. So I would say that Hayek's thesis has certainly not been disproved, but we don't have the kind of thing that he was arguing against. What he was arguing against were these was the kind of socialism that the Labor Party was promoting, and taking over the big business, the commanding heights of the economy. You take over the mines, you take over the railways, the government takes over all these things and runs them, and then leaves the markets for everything else. And this commanding heights theory basically brought Britain to the brink of poverty and destitution in the late 70s, and they gave it up and sold most of that crap. The mines and all that kind of stuff. It just didn't work. And the idea that kind of stuff was grindingly inefficient. And if taken further, if they'd gone the Nazi and Italian route by telling companies what to do minutely, like many progressives want, by the way. the regulation they want is that pretty much a company can't do anything without the permission and the instruction of government. Well, that's what Hayek was arguing against in The Road to Serfdom. That does lead to totalitarianism. It is, frankly, totalitarianism, and I'm glad we don't have it to that extent. But we do have something clunkier and uglier and much more in line with what this man wants. And he's defending the status quo, basically, and he's doing it while denying the nastiness that goes on every day.
Well, but his contention is that libertarians have this sort of psychological deviance in that they're so wedded to a binary view of the world that they miss the rational compromises that need to be made. How do you respond to perhaps unwittingly anti-government libertarians would have us trade democratic self-governance for an oligarchy?
I want the evidence. He's just contending that's the case. I don't know anybody who wants.
The evidence is where the libertarians want to give all the power to the oligarchs, like Enron and capital management and the bankers. They control our common interest. We want to give them more power.
No, Enron was
free markets routinely are distorted by the wealthy and the powerful, and the libertarian.
What does that mean?
More taxes, less regulation, and less government plays into their hands.
This is silliness. That's just nothing there. I mean, Enron was engaging in vast corruption. And government should be involved. Whatever institutions you have in society that libertarians do support. We support law, we support police, that kind of stuff. However that's done, whatever organization that's done in, we want frauds to be nabbed and people who are, and that's what Enron was. It's a huge, vast fraud.
But libertarians and conservatives want less regulation. They want less government oversight. They want lower taxes. And that's how these guys get away with what they do.
Frauds get found out when that just happens. We had the basic law of fraud is that you have to wait until it happens, right? And then when you find it and discover it, then you prosecute. That's what you do. Bernie Madoff was regulated by FEC regulators for years. They went through his books and they never found what was right in front of their nose. And we're supposed to think that regulators know they don't know diddly squat half the time.
That's because the Republicans have cut out the funding for all these regulators, and they don't have the funding or the resources they need to do their jobs.
Okay, if the person who hears that or says that does not detect special pleading and dishonesty in that kind of attack, I don't know what to say. Because, of course, I just gave an example of regulators repeatedly looking through the books and not finding a fraud. A blatant fraud, by the way. This wasn't a clever fraud like Enron. Enron had clever frauds. And I would say that its leaders in those frauds were evil men. But geez, Bernie Madoff was just right in front of the open. It was easy to see, but they didn't see it. Because regulators are just kludge masters. They're there to slow things down and make things difficult. And why is that wanted by some people? Well, it's wanted by big businesses because big businesses can handle the kludge, and small business competitor upstarts can't. So the reason there's oligarchies in business is because government is in the business of colluding with big business through the regulatory apparatus and antitrust, by the way, and squelching competitors. It's just stupid. There's no there in this argument. This argument is silly.
So you don't think if we gave more funding to regulatory agencies, they couldn't do their job better?
We tripled the amount of money given to public schools, and during that same period of time when the public schools just wasted the money and kids learned less. Government is a fuck up central. I mean, they're just bad at doing things, and you want a lean, tough organizations that can nab the obvious bad guys and investigate things that need to be investigated. But regulation is just not always the way to go. Regulation is not the same as the rule of law, and rule of law solutions generally work better. Bankruptcy court, for instance, is a rule of law solution. It's what happened when a business could no longer pay its bills, and basically it's basically just irresponsible. then the government just closes it down, sets up a receivership, and starts liquidating assets and selling off stuff and trying to pay off the highest marked creditors. I mean, it's just, this is what, I don't know any libertarians against this stuff. Libertarians aren't against that. What we're against is the stuff that he thinks works but doesn't. We're against, Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank and all these huge regulatory regimes that give the veneer of competence to government, but really only amount to huge, vast weight, and it's like throwing sand in the gears of an automobile. It just brings everything down, and the big companies, well, if they have to have regulation, they want the regulation that serves them, and regulations that require a lot of reporting and paying for this and getting the investigators in, all that stuff comes at a cost, and the cost is hard to bear by upstarts. So it basically means that there's fewer upstarts and we have a less competitive economy than we otherwise would have had.
Final thoughts?
Well, my final thought is that this person, this Ph.D. philosopher cum ideologue, this person doesn't know much about what he's attacking, and he ascribes to it vices it does not have, and misinterprets writers that he has probably not read. And this is the standard for critiques of libertarianism, and it's very sad. There have been good critiques of libertarianism written. Henry Sidgwick wrote a brilliant 2 pages back in the 1800s. Almost no one ever deals with that because that would require people to think. I mean, that's a really interesting critique of libertarianism. This kind of stuff is embarrassing for mankind.